Every medieval winter, entire villages would go silent. No smoke from chimneys, no voices in the streets. Medieval people feared winter more than war, and even more than plague. So if you think you could survive back then, winter would prove you wrong. The first problem was the homes themselves. Medieval homes were built with the same attention to insulation as a cardboard box. Most houses used wattle and daub construction, which meant weaving sticks together and slapping mud mixed with animal dung on top. Building materials were basically whatever nature threw at you. This construction method created walls that were only a few inches thick and offered minimal protection from harsh weather. The walls were thinner than modern pizza boxes and about as effective at keeping out cold air. Stone houses existed for wealthy families, but even these felt like living inside a cave during winter months. Mortar would crack when temperatures dropped, creating gaps that invited freezing winds to make themselves comfortable indoors. Windows were holes in walls that could be covered with wooden shutters or oiled cloth. Glass was so expensive that most people had never seen it, let alone owned any. During storms, families chose between freezing with shutters open or suffocating with them closed. Medieval windows were like playing peekaboo with hypothermia. Thatched roofs made from bundled straw and grass provided some protection when dry, but winter storms turned them into soggy messes. Snow would melt through the thatch, creating indoor rain that nobody wanted. Thatched roofs were like wearing a sponge hat in a thunderstorm. The thatch would become heavy when wet, sometimes causing roofs to sag or collapse entirely. Floors were packed with dirt or clay, sometimes covered with rushes or straw for insulation. During winter, these floors became frozen mud that sucked warmth from feet and made walking around feel like standing on ice blocks. The straw covering attracted mice, rats, and fleas that treated homes like all-inclusive resorts. Heat came from a single fire pit in the center of the main room. This fire had to cook food, provide warmth, and create light all at the same time. The fire pit was usually just stones arranged in a circle with smoke rising through a hole in the roof. Managing this fire required constant attention. When wind blew in the wrong direction, smoke would fill the entire house instead of escaping through the roof opening. Everyone's eyes would water and lungs would burn, but the alternative was freezing to death. Families developed chronic coughs and respiratory problems from constant smoke exposure. Chimneys were rare and poorly designed when they existed. Early chimneys either pulled smoke badly, filling houses with fumes, or worked too well, sucking all the heat outside. The few chimneys that were built often cracked in cold weather or became blocked by debris. Bedrooms were never heated because fuel was too precious to waste on rooms used only for sleeping. People wore all their clothes to bed and piled on heavy blankets made from wool or animal furs. Entire families often shared beds to combine body heat for survival. The main room's fire could only warm about 10 feet in any direction effectively. Walking to the far corners of a house meant traveling from summer to winter in just a few steps. Frost would form on the inside walls during particularly cold nights. People woke up to see their breath indoors and find ice crystals decorating their walls. Wealthy families might have had braziers, metal containers filled with burning charcoal that could be moved around the house. However, these were expensive, dangerous, and produced deadly fumes if not properly ventilated. Medieval portable heating was like playing Russian roulette with invisible poison gas. Even if you managed to keep from freezing, winter had other ways to test your survival. Medieval food storage was a high-stakes guessing game where losing meant starvation. The harvest season in late summer and early fall determined whether families would eat or die during the following winter. Medieval farmers were basically gambling with their lives every harvest season. Preservation techniques were limited and unreliable. Salt was the most common preservative, but it cost more than most families could afford to use generously. Meat was packed in salt or cut into strips and dried into jerky that had the texture and taste of old leather. The salt curing process could take weeks, and if done incorrectly, the meat would spoil anyway. Smoking meat required weeks of constant attention and the right type of wood. Too much heat would cook the meat instead of preserving it, while too little would leave it vulnerable to rot. The smoking process meant keeping fires burning day and night for extended periods. Different types of wood produce different flavors and preservation qualities. Vegetables presented their own storage challenges. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots could be buried in dry places, but many would still freeze solid or rot before spring. Cabbage could be fermented into sauerkraut, creating a sour, mushy substance that was barely edible. Onions could be braided in dry areas, but they would eventually sprout or rot. Grain storage was a constant battle against moisture, mold, and pests. Wheat and barley were kept in cloth sacks, wooden barrels that weren't airtight. One damp spell could ruin an entire family's grain supply, turning it into a moldy mess that would make people sick. Medieval pantries were basically science experiments where failure meant death. Rats were expert grain thieves that could find ways into almost any storage container. They didn't just eat the grain. They contaminated everything with their droppings, making even untouched portions dangerous to consume. A single rat family could destroy weeks worth of food in a short time. Most peasant families couldn't afford to feed livestock through winter months. Animals required grain that needed to survive. So most cattle, pigs, and chickens were slaughtered in the fall. This created a temporary abundance of fresh meat that had to be preserved quickly before it spoiled. The mental stress of watching food supply shrink was enormous. Families would start rationing early in winter, calculating exactly how much they could each day to make supplies last until spring. Medieval diet plans were designed by starvation, not by choice. Parents would often give their portions to children, slowly starving themselves to keep their families alive. Bread made from old or moldy grain was often the only option available. This bread was hard, bitter, sometimes fungi that could cause illness or death. People would soak stale bread in whatever liquid was available to make it edible. During the worst times, bread was made from ground acorns, bark, or other substances that provided minimal nutrition. Wealthy families had access to imported foods like spices, dried fruits, and preserved fish, but even these luxuries were limited during winter months. Trade routes became impassable, and merchants couldn't transport goods safely. Medieval grocery shopping had a 6-month off-season with no rain checks. Of course, having enough food was only useful if you had the strength to last the winter months ahead. Winter didn't mean rest time for medieval people. Daily tasks became twice as difficult when everything was frozen, but they still had to be done to survive. Medieval winter schedules were like trying to fit a full day's work into a coffee break. Water collection turned into a daily wrestling match with nature. Wells, streams, and ponds froze over with ice thick enough to walk on. Breaking through required heavy tools, muscle power, and stubborn determination. The ice could be several inches thick, requiring axes or heavy stones to break through. Hauling water back home before it solid in containers was a race against time. Clay pots would crack if water turned to ice inside them, destroying valuable vessels that took skilled potters weeks to make. Medieval water delivery was like running a relay race against physics. Firewood gathering was a never-ending treasure hunt where the treasure was literally keeping you alive. Early winter offered dead branches and fallen trees, but as these were used up, people had to venture farther from home and work harder for fuel. Fresh wood had to be seasoned and dried before it would burn properly. Cutting frozen wood was backbreaking labor that tested both tools and human endurance. Axes would stick in frozen logs like they were glued there, requiring extra strength to pull free. Metal tools became brittle in extreme cold and could shatter if struck wrong. People had to warm their tools by the fire before use and work in short bursts. Livestock required constant care and attention during winter months. Animals had to be sheltered, fed, and kept warm enough to survive. Many families brought cows, pigs, and chickens indoors during the coldest periods. Medieval homes became combination people and animal shelters. The animals provided some additional warmth, but they also created sanitation problems. Roof maintenance became critical during winter storms. Snow would pile up until the roof sagged under the weight, threatening to collapse entirely. Ice dams would form and create leaks that had to be patched immediately. Climbing on icy roofs was extremely dangerous, but ignoring roof problems could result in the house becoming uninhabitable. Tool care became essential when replacement was impossible until spring. Axes, knives, and hammers had to be sharpened, cleaned, and maintained constantly. Broken tools often meant the difference between completing necessary work and facing serious problems. Metal tools were precious and had to be protected from rust and damage. Indoor work continued around the clock during winter months. Wool had to be spun into thread woven into cloth, and cloth sewn into clothing and blankets. This detailed work was done by dim firelight, straining eyes and requiring intense focus. Women and children spent long hours spinning, weaving, and sewing. Clothing repair was ongoing and essential. Garments had to last for years, so every tear or worn spot required immediate attention. People would patch clothes with whatever fabric was available, often resulting in garments that were more patchy than original material. Food preparation took much longer when everything was frozen or preserved. Vegetables had to be thawed and cleaned carefully. Preserved meats needed soaking to remove excess salt. Simple meals became complex projects requiring hours of preparation. Medieval cooking was like preparing dinner while wearing mittens in a freezer. The physical demands of winter wore people down quickly. Malnutrition made everyone weaker, while cold weather made muscles stiff and joints painful. People developed chronic conditions from the constant strain of winter survival. Unfortunately, all this exhausting work left people vulnerable in ways they never expected. Medieval medicine was about as advanced as medieval space travel, which is to say it didn't exist. Medical knowledge was based on superstition, tradition, and guesswork rather than scientific understanding. Most people believed that illness was caused by bad air, divine punishment, or imbalanced bodily humors. Wound care consisted of cleaning injuries with whatever liquid was handy. Water was the most common choice. Sometimes wine if the family had money, and occasionally other fluids that people mistakenly believed had healing properties. Medieval first aid was like playing medical roulette with dirty water. Infection was a silent killer that nobody understood. Tiny bacteria that couldn't be seen were deadlier than wolves or bears. A small cut from a kitchen knife could develop red streaks, cause fever, and eventually blood poisoning. People noticed that some wounds healed while others became infected, but they had no understanding of why. Medical tools were used for multiple purposes without any cleaning between uses. The same knife that butchered a pig might be used to cut bread and then treat a wound. Needles used for sewing were also used for medical procedures. The idea that tools could carry invisible contamination was foreign to medieval thinking. Frostbite was a common winter injury that often led to serious complications. Fingers and toes would turn white, then purple, then black as tissue died from the lack of blood flow. Treatment involved warming the affected area, sometimes with direct heat that actually made the damage worse. Medieval frostbite treatment was like trying to fix frozen pipes with a blowtorch. Severe frostbite sometimes required cutting off fingers or toes. This surgery was performed without any pain relief, using whatever sharp tools were available. Patients would bite on leather strips to deal with the agony. The amputation itself was traumatic, but the risk of infection afterward was often fatal. Burns happened constantly due to open fires, cooking accidents, and desperate attempts to stay warm. Treatment involved applying various substances to wounds. Butter, honey, mud, or whatever else people thought might help. Some of these treatments were harmless, while others introduced infections or delayed healing. Broken bones were set using wooden boards and strips, but without understanding of how bones actually healed. Many fractures mended incorrectly, leaving people with crooked limbs and constant pain. Medieval orthopedics was like trying to fix furniture with bandages and hope. Pain relief was almost non-existent. Willow bark could be chewed for mild comfort, but it wasn't always available and didn't help much with serious injuries. Most people just endured whatever pain they experienced. The ability to tolerate pain was considered a virtue, and people had no choice but to develop high pain tolerance. Parasites made every injury worse. Lice, fleas, and various worms lived on and inside human bodies, carrying diseases and slowing healing. Medieval people were walking hotels for unwanted guests. These parasites would infest wounds, making infection more likely and healing more difficult. Dental problems were universal and could become life-threatening. Tooth infections could spread to the brain or bloodstream, causing death. Tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia, using crude tools like pliers or knives. Many people died from complications of dental procedures. Eye injuries were particularly serious because people had to work in dim light with dangerous tools. Sparks from fires, wood splinters, and sharp implements could cause permanent blindness. There was no treatment for eye injuries, and people who lost their sight became completely dependent on their families for survival. The fear of injury shaped every aspect of daily life. People moved carefully, avoided risks when possible, but still couldn't prevent all accidents. Every activity carried the potential for injury, and people were constantly aware that a single mistake could be fatal. When individuals struggled this much, entire communities began to face their own breaking points. Medieval village cooperation was like a house of cards built during an earthquake. It looked stable until pressure hit, then everything collapsed at once. During good times, communities functioned on principles of mutual aid, shared resources, and collective responsibility. However, winter conditions tested these bonds to their breaking point. Mutual aid that functioned during good times broke down when resources became scarce. Neighbors who had always helped each other suddenly became protective of their supplies. When everyone was struggling to survive, generosity became a luxury that families could afford. Medieval sharing was like trying to split a single cracker among 20 hungry people. Borrowing and lending became sources of conflict instead of community bonding. When someone borrowed grain or firewood in December, both parties knew repayment was unlikely. The informal credit systems that worked during harvest season failed completely when there were no extra resources to share. The unwritten rules that held communities together during other seasons shattered under winter pressure. People who had always been reliable neighbors might suddenly refuse to share basic necessities. Social hierarchies became more pronounced as wealthy families hoarded resources, while poor families faced starvation. Medieval social contracts had an expiration date that usually arrived in January. Churches and monasteries tried to provide assistance, but they faced the same shortages as everyone else. Religious institutions could only distribute what they had, which often wasn't much. Monasteries that seemed wealthy during harvest time revealed their limitations when called upon to feed entire communities. Wealthy landowners who normally provided some protection for their tenants often disappeared during winter months. Many nobles retreated to better supplied castles or traveled to warmer regions. The feudal system that promised protection in exchange for labor and loyalty broke down when lords abandoned their responsibilities. Geographic separation made community support nearly impossible during severe weather. Villages might be separated by miles of dangerous terrain that became impassable during storms. Medieval communication networks had the reliability of smoke signals in a hurricane. When illness struck, communities faced terrible choices. Helping sick neighbors meant risking infection, but refusing help meant watching people die alone. Families with sick members were often shunned by their neighbors, creating a cruel isolation when support was most needed. Competition for limited resources led to increased theft and violence. Desperate families would steal firewood, food, or anything else they needed to survive. Accusations of theft could tear apart relationships that had taken generations to build. The social trust that held communities together eroded as desperation increased. Local authorities struggled to maintain order during winter months. Traveling to resolve disputes or enforce laws was difficult and dangerous. Many conflicts were left unresolved until spring, allowing resentments to fester and grow. The justice system that functioned during other seasons essentially shut down. Markets and trading centers that served as community gathering places closed during harsh weather. This eliminated not just economic opportunities, but also the social connections that helped people cope with isolation. The weekly market days that provided news, gossip, and social interaction disappeared for months at a time. Trade networks that operated during warmer months completely shut down when roads became dangerous. Merchants couldn't travel safely, and even if they could, small transactions weren't worth risking their lives. The flow of goods, information, and people that connected communities during other seasons stopped entirely. Even when communities managed to organize mutual aid, help often arrived too late to be effective. By the time neighbors realized someone was in serious trouble, that person might already be beyond saving. Medieval emergency response was like calling for help and hoping someone would find your body before spring. With communities falling apart and people weakened by months of hardship, winter saved its deadliest weapon for last. Medieval winters created disease breeding grounds that would make modern scientists run away screaming. The combination of factors that promoted illness was so complete and devastating that epidemics were virtually inevitable every winter season. Medieval winter health conditions were like a biological weapons laboratory run by amateurs. Cold temperatures, poor nutrition, and cramped living conditions turned human bodies into welcome mats for every illness in the area. People's natural defenses were already weakened from hunger and stress, making them about as resistant to disease as paper towels are to water. The immune systems that might have fought off infections during healthy times were compromised by malnutrition. Respiratory illnesses were the biggest killers during winter months. Simple colds developed into pneumonia, which was essentially a death sentence. Constant exposure to wood smoke had already damaged most people's lungs, making them more vulnerable to serious infections. Medieval winter air quality was like breathing through a wet sock filled with ash. Influenza swept through communities like wildfire through dry grass. The virus would arrive with a traveler, and within days, entire households would be bedridden with fever, aches, and breathing difficulties. The close quarters that families used for warmth also facilitated disease transmission. Sharing homes with livestock during winter created new opportunities for diseases to jump between animals and humans. Families who brought cows, pigs, and chickens indoors for warmth also invited whatever illnesses these animals carried. The poor sanitation that resulted from housing animals and humans together created ideal conditions for bacterial infections. Waterborne illnesses remained common even in winter because water sources were contaminated with waste from humans and animals. Drinking water was often more dangerous than the diseases it was supposed to help treat. Ice and snow didn't purify water. They just made contamination harder to detect. Tuberculosis thrived in the cold, damp conditions of medieval homes. The disease spread through respiratory droplets in poorly ventilated spaces where multiple people lived together. The chronic coughing that characterized tuberculosis was often mistaken for a normal winter cough until the disease had progressed too far to treat. Children were especially vulnerable to winter diseases. Their smaller bodies couldn't fight infections as effectively as adults, and they needed more calories per pound to maintain body heat. Child mortality rates during winter were staggering. Some communities lost a quarter of their children every winter. Treatment options were limited and often made patients worse instead of better. Bloodletting was a popular treatment that weakened people who were already fighting for their lives. The theory was that removing bad blood would cure illness, but in reality, it just made sick people weaker and more likely to die. Herbal remedies were sometimes helpful, but most people lacked access to the right plants or knowledge about proper preparation. The herbs that might have been effective were often unavailable during winter months when they were most needed. Fear of illness shaped behavior throughout winter months. People avoided gatherings and became suspicious of anyone who seemed even slightly unwell. The isolation that resulted from fear of disease often made survival even more difficult by breaking down the cooperation that communities needed to function. When disease outbreaks occurred during resource shortages, the results were catastrophic. Weakened populations couldn't fight off infections, and communities lacked resources to care for the sick. Medieval pandemics were like perfect storms designed by the Grim Reaper himself. Medieval winter was nature's ultimate endurance test, where survival required constant vigilance, unwavering determination, and more than a little luck to see another spring. Do you think you could survive it?